I am Trent Van Epps. As mentioned, I work at the Ethereum Foundation, but primarily I work on this project called Protocol Guild, which is a collective of core developers that work on Ethereum. It's a peer-managed organization that helps to distribute funding to about 200 different individuals. I'll touch on it in the middle of the presentation, but this is largely going to be about the title, Ethereum Governance. The work at the Ethereum Foundation is, as written, I do protocol coordination, so figuring out stakeholders who need to engage in this particular governance topic, how certain changes affect them, how they can best engage in the governance of this complex resource system. Thanks to Tim and Mark for some of the stuff I'm borrowing. You'll see it in the slides. So this talk is caveat. This talk is going to be different than probably a lot of the research talks that you've been listening to and enjoying. It's going to be high level, again, about governance of a software ecosystem. And it might be a little bit more opinionated than some of these other talks, but hopefully my arguments are convincing enough that you're nodding along by the end, or at least can see how I make the argument. So we're going to zoom out really, really far to start. If you're from an economics background, you might be familiar with this 2x2 of resources or goods being divided up between rivalry and excludability. I'm not going to get into this. Another caveat, I love that everyone has a ton of questions. Usually at crypto conferences, sometimes there's just blank faces, but I will, in order to keep presentation moving, I might limit it to like 1 or 2 questions per slide, but please do ask, because if you're thinking about it or asking about it, there's probably 5 other people who aren't raising their hand. So very high level, this is how, this is a framework for defining how goods can, the characteristics that goods have in their production, whether they're a rival, another term that sometimes uses subtractability, but I'm going to assume that people generally understand what this is. In recent years, this has been expanded to include the term anti-rival, and this is things that actually benefit from having more users. And this is typically limited to things that are non-physical, right? Open source software, blockchains, these are things that benefit from many, many users. Standards would also fall into this category. And this is what we're concerned with, like I said. So anti-rival, non-excludable, we have open source software, and blockchains, I think, fall into this category. Network goods like ETH, the asset. I can own some, but you can't own my ETH, so it's in the excludable category, but there is benefits to many, many people using or depending on ETH as a money, right? So there's scalable benefits as more and more people use it. And then block space or blobs, these are scarce resources that anybody can access. And why does this matter? It matters because blockchains are more than just pure technical constructions. And I think sometimes we need to be reminded of this. Unfortunately, I spend all of my time thinking about it, so I think I'm already convinced, but it's worth reminding ourselves that these aren't just bits of software or a proof or a theorem that sits in isolation. These are social systems that are produced in a political economy, and this matters a lot. The asterisks for these resources which are being produced being the software, the network, and the asset. For example, a blockchain produced by the US government would have a very different set of guarantees or characteristics than one produced by a global set of validators from all around the world that anybody can produce blocks. Similarly, a blockchain that's produced by a US-based corporation that is profit motivated is going to have a very different set of affordances or design capabilities than something like Ethereum. So this is the context we should, or I'm suggesting that we think about blockchains in, and not think about them just as bits of software that kind of sit in a repository somewhere. They're living, breathing systems. So this is the opinionated bit, and then I'll back it up hopefully with some context. Ethereum is the only chain with open and comprehensive specifications, which means anybody can make their own implementation. This relates to the software. Second, it has many independent client implementations. So it's not that we just have the possibility of there being client implementations. There's a really healthy diversity of different clients that are used on the network today. And this has some nice benefits, 100% uptime since launch, and it allows for a pluralist power distribution. There's no single organization or single bit of software or the team that manages that bit of software. They don't have, oversight over every single feature, right? There's this painful process of rough consensus that always has to be reached before any change to the network software is actually brought about. And then finally, it has no on-chain governance, which is pretty unique for a proof of stake system. Other chains that use proof of stake, they have a voting system where, validators can put up a proposal to say, we should lower issuance by X%, and then all of the validators and potentially people who have delegated to them vote on it, and then there's a decision, yes or no. This is just a different design trade-off. It's a different design space, but in Ethereum, this does not exist. And so the process of coming to consensus is purely off-chain. And again, through this painful iterative discussion of figuring out what trade-offs are worth pursuing. And ultimately, this constrains capital as voice. Google can't show up with $1 billion and say, all right, I control Ethereum governance. Similar, like no other large capital asset holder can do that. And there are many, many other characteristics that I think make Ethereum special, but these three I'm just choosing to focus on because they align with the software, the network, and then the asset. Yes, question.
For researchers, like if I want to quantify governance across different chains, do you have any suggestions how we do that? Because we have a subjective sense about Ethereum as a more full plan. Do you have any suggestions?
There's probably a lot of academic literature that would point you in a direction of like quantifying, like there's Gini coefficients for the distribution of asset ownership. I imagine there's something similar in like how power is distributed. Like if you have 10 independent teams that are fully independent, they have independent funding streams, that's probably better than there just being a single entity that makes all decisions. So I don't know entirely how to quantify that. Yeah, the big difference being like you could look at the Gini coefficient of the validator distribution. Like what are the top 20% of large validators? How much power do they have? And how easy is it for them to sway votes in a particular way? But then of course this doesn't work for Ethereum because there's no on-chain governance in that way. Yes.
Has there been an Ethereum improvement proposal that has gone through that was not supported by Vitalik?
By the what? Vitalik? That's a good question. I don't, and sorry, I'm supposed to repeat these questions. Has there ever been an EIP that went through that Vitalik did not support? Anything come to mind?
Explicitly does not have opinions on any of, like, since a few years ago, he just doesn't voice opinions either pro or contra. So
yeah,
by design, they're neither was with the support or against the support.
Yeah, he's in the difficult position of having started a decentralized network that needs to survive without him. So he's largely recused himself from a lot of this decision making. So we may never know, unfortunately.
There are many proposals now that have absolutely no involvement of
his. I would say he's largely stepped back from even commenting publicly on most of the ongoing research and specific EIPs. Anything else? Maybe I saw one more hand. Yeah.
Kind of relatedly, who has veto power for like an EIP in this process, right? I can imagine like execution client developers probably have a big voice in this, right? Because if they don't, deploy it, it's not going to happen. But,
yeah. So the question was, who has veto power? And the answer is both no one does, and it's complicated, but we'll get there. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. And if there's anything I don't cover, it comes up later, I will share my handle, or you can just come up to me after. So the pros and cons of this unique system is permissionless. Anybody can show up. Any of you could show up to the calls and advocate for whatever you think is important. contingent on it being relevant and you're respectful of other people's times. But literally anybody can join these regular calls and make a case for a particular feature or to present some research if it's relevant to, the current features we're talking about. It's very capture resistant and credibly neutral because there's no cemented decision maker. This means that it's really hard for people to game this decision-making process. There's no voting process, so you don't have to figure out, all right, I just need 30% of quorum and then I can ram through my proposal. This doesn't happen. And finally, it has redundant checks and balances from different parts of the community. And again, we'll get to this next. Cons, from the outside, it's really hard to navigate without really extensive context that sometimes can take 6 months, a year to really build up over time, which has trade-offs. And then from the inside, it's hard for us as well to gauge community consensus across these diverse groups. So I think it's a good system for the outcomes that we're able to achieve. It does not mean that there aren't trade-offs. So what is being governed? Again, I'm sticking with this tripartite trinity of the software, the network, and the asset. So the protocol rules, things that we must agree on, are the consensus rules. Otherwise, the network falls apart. And then there are nice to have protocol rules like the networking or the gossiping between different nodes. Ideally, these are the same between implementations, but it's not the end of the world if they have some variation. The mainnet state, again, it's being governed. This is what we're most concerned about. There are other abstractions like L2s that people have talked about that reuse the EVM or some of the software that these core developers maintain. But we're most concerned with the mainnet state. And then finally, ETH monetary policy, the supply, the issuance, any second order effects to changing. For example, there would be second order effects if the issuance were changed in the DeFi ecosystem. So these are the things that are being governed when we talk about Ethereum governance. And I've touched on a few of these, but this is like the onion model of people who are closest to contribution, decision making, and basically the stakeholder set that governs Ethereum. And we'll go through each of these in turn. And a frame I really find useful and have talked about for the past few years is that Ethereum is a commons. Again, if you're familiar with public goods, the idea of commons is not too far off from it, but it's generally a system that is producing shared resources. Historically, the physical examples of these were pastures. The commons in England are I've done this before, a very common example of commons. Very typical example, fisheries, forests, any kind of shared irrigation. Historically, these were very, very typical throughout the world. And we can apply that to the digital space, right? And these make up the broader Ethereum commons of these resources that we're producing. And the way we frame that is that Ethereum is made up of shared resources. The network includes the mainnet state, the broader set of EVM chains, the history of the blockchain, and by history, this is specifically referring to like past state, not a history book. Different forks and layer twos, right? These are all part of the broader Ethereum commons. Then we have the asset Ether on mainnet, and it can be taken in a bunch of different forms. It can be wrapped. There are derivatives that are restaked or bridged to different places like an ETF, right? It's a representation that's outside of its originating context. And then finally, the software media, including the specifications that I mentioned earlier, research, client software, transcripts, the EVM, and then the artifacts of governance, which are transcripts and EIPs. And all three of these, the confluence of these three resource types makes up what we call Ethereum mainnet, and then the broader Ethereum commons is like derivative forms of these in their context. So let's zoom into that first group that I mentioned, the Ethereum core devs, kind of at the center of the onion. The people that maintain mainnet today there's quite a wide diversity. Some of them work at nonprofits like the Ethereum Foundation, myself, and some of the other people here. We work at a nonprofit. But obviously, the Ethereum Foundation is not the only entity, and this ranges from other nonprofits. There's academics in that center square. It's labeled other org or no affiliations, independent anon or pseudo anons, companies, venture capital. We have Paradigm in the corner. It's a very pluralistic set of entities that are engaging in this governance. So this is the set of people who are, thinking about what features are important for mainnet and how to make sure we release something that's secure and is ultimately beneficial for end users, gives them lower fees. This is kind of the core set of people who think about this stuff day in and day out. It's their full-time job. I mentioned this at the beginning, but I work on a project called Protocol Guild, which takes the individuals out of all these disparate entities and binds them together into a larger collective organization. And this does a few things that are very beneficial for a commons production system, but it basically gives them legibility on a much broader scale outside of their employer or their formal affiliation. Slight segue on what Protocol Guild is. It's this independent funding org that operates on chain, fully transparent. So if you wanted to see the funding that we've distributed over the past few years, you can see this on chain. It's comprehensive in that it covers all of core development. It's self-governed by its peer members. And the funding goes direct to the individuals, which returns some optionality or agency back to them instead of it being filtered through their employer. So it's definitely a political project. I wouldn't quite call it a union, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood. Today we fund about 185 members, and we've distributed 34 million since 2022 and expect to distribute 44 million over the next 4 years. And this is important because there's a pretty significant compensation discrepancy between people who are working on something that their values aligned with, that they feel it's important for me to work on this, or it's important for the world. There's a big discrepancy between doing that work and what the industry can offer you. We found that there's up to a 50% gap between what you could make and what you are making. And so Protocol Guild helps to reduce that gap. And 60% of the membership rank this funding as extremely important. Okay. If you're curious about this organization or want to learn more about it, of course, come talk to me. Yes. Sure. The question is, who's funding this? And the answer is the broader ecosystem. So one of the things you pass up by working at the Ethereum Foundation or generally on core development is equity or a new token. For example, layer 2s typically have a new token. The Ethereum protocol is not going to issue you equity. There's just certain constraints that you accept when you work on something that is values aligned, you think it's important. And so the broader ecosystem is slowly understanding that it's part of their responsibility to hopefully make up some of this gap that people pass up to work on this foundational software. Anyone else? Okay.
So one quick question.
Mm-hmm.
You did a great job of explaining sort of the philosophy.
Yeah.
But operationally, just like a corporation, private corporation would have, board of directors who kind of get together and make the routine and big decisions in the company.
Yeah.
Is there such an operational entity inside Ethereum or
The question is, who actually makes decisions?
an ongoing basis?
It's basically this set of participants. So there's no single person, like there was a question earlier about who has veto power. There's no veto power. Ultimately, it's up to these people and the entities that they work at to come to consensus on
Is there a power hierarchy within this group or not?
I would say, the Ethereum Foundation has a particular cachet as being, we're a nonprofit. This is our sole responsibility is to steward Ethereum and the broader ecosystem. There's probably some social cachet. and you know, there's a mutual respect between a lot of the organizations, but I would say it is quite meritocratic in the sense of if you're just showing up and you have a good idea, you can come pitch your idea and your EIP, and there's a very good chance that it will be included. Maybe we should have data on like the earliest time somebody showed up and then like they got some protocol change in.
Maybe just as an example, because I think people always have a hard time believing, but actually, you know, actually it's Vitalik and actually it's the Ethereum Foundation.
Yeah.
Just this last week, we actually made a final decision on one of the big headline features for the next upcoming hard fork, and we decided as a group to choose a feature that actually most of us from the Ethereum Foundation were a bit skeptical about. So, and then we were overridden by the majority of the stakeholders here. So these things actually do happen. It's not just a theoretical consideration. It is really like a open coming to consensus.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
Yes.
Like operationally, do you like get together and brainstorm and discuss?
We will get to that. Yeah. I've got some slides.
Are people that need to coordinate, discuss options that.
Yep.
It's costly.
Yes,
Wise.
very. So the question is, how do you actually do this in practice? And that's what we'll talk about next. Okay, so this Protocol Guild, it's a really great organization. To your question, where does this happen? How does this happen actually in practice? So as I'm sure most of you do this these days, the majority of your collaborations happen online, right? You're not in person with other academics or people that you're writing papers with. It's the same is true for Ethereum. It's an internet native collaborative ecosystem, and we heavily lean on this stuff. So Discord, there's a couple different forums. There's ETH Research, which is the top image on the right, and that's like more high level cryptography or like big picture constructions. And then there's the Ethereum Magicians Forum, which is more of the nitty gritty details of how do we actually implement this EIP? How do we get this feature from a proposal to it being live running code on the network? So there's a couple different forums, and of course, Telegram Signal. And unfortunately, we have to use Twitter. It's a horrible media environment, but like this is where people choose to congregate, and we have to kind of tap into that. The main online forum is ACD, All Core Devs. And again, all of this stuff is public. Anybody can look at this. You can look at the transcripts. You can watch the recordings. They're live streamed. This protocol calendar I'm showing is for next week. There's a number of calls. Not every person that I showed on these previous slides is showing up to all these calls. That would be a little crazy. But I would say typically, like for myself, I'm attending the one on Thursday. This is kind of the main call. I don't know which one it is. Execution. So the execution layer is having an hour-and-a-half coordination call on Thursday, and then there's a testing call on Monday, and different breakout calls for particular features. So people kind of self-organize and then generally split the responsibility of attending ones that are relevant to them. And there's again, a public agenda. You can post what you'd like to talk about. If it's relevant to where we're at in a release cycle, you'll be added to the agenda and then given time to speak on the call itself. The internet is great and wonderful, but it can't beat being in person. So one of the true joys is when we actually do meet up in person, and you can see the images. There's increasingly more and more people over the years. So these are, I think, most of the physical in-person meetups we've had over the years. Sometimes they're related to a specific feature. For example, in 2019, it was about the beacon chain launching, like Ethereum launching this proof of stake network. And then other times it's more of a general, like the one this year in Berlin was on a number of topics, ZK EVMs, and just a whole bunch of different topics. So it is really a joy to meet up in person and just be able to have that high bandwidth discussion back and forth. These are less common, but really nice to have when we do have them. The framework that I've mentioned a few times is EIPs, and it stands for Ethereum Improvement Proposals. And this is how kind of the change management process to get the specifications that underlie Ethereum to include a new feature or change in a particular way. And this is referencing Bitcoin, BIPs, and those are referencing Python PEPs, Python enhancement proposals. So we're not reinventing the wheel. There's existing open source communities that have used these processes for a long time, and we're just kind of adapting it for our context. A little bit more detail on that. EIPs typically require a champion, especially if it's a larger change. It requires somebody to take it on and be the main person who will communicate and advocate for it within this broader core developer community. And typically this means working closely with the implementers or the different research teams. And yeah, we want them to demonstrate value, the soundness, and generate momentum. And there's been some questions about voting, or I've mentioned that we don't have voting. If you're familiar with the IETF, they have this idea of rough consensus, which is, well, in person they used to hum. We don't hum, though maybe we should try that. That would be interesting. But it's just this iterative discussion, and people voice their preferences. Sometimes they're very strong preferences, and it can take a little bit of time to get everybody on the same page, or to, let's say, sort between the different buckets of options. But eventually we come to a decision. And as Ansgar mentioned, just last week, or was it this week, there was some people had some pushback on a particular feature, and ultimately the core dev community decided to go forward even though there was some contention. Yeah, no voting, no on-chain governance, particularly by ETH holders. Oftentimes asset holders, they don't have the particular intimate context for the trade-offs of different decisions for protocol design or mechanism design. And I'm very happy that we have avoided this outcome personally. Then once we have a bundle of EIPs, this is Fusaka, which is going live in December, assuming no delays. But the upgrade will include a bunch of EIPs, including PeerDOS, which will, other people have touched on this before me today, increase the number of blobs. There's some repricing or changes to specific mechanics. I'm not going to get into all of these because these guys will. But once we have something that's sufficient to warrant actually pushing out a release, because all of these staking operators, they have to upgrade their software. It's not trivial to do it, and they want to make sure they don't lose funds along the way. So once we have a bundle of features that kind of meet that level, we decide, okay, this is the release, these are the things we're including, and we start to put it on test nets, and then it eventually comes to the mainnet release, again, hopefully in December. So going back to this onion diagram, the question of who governs, I'm going to move out from core contributors because I spent a lot of time on that one. Oh, right. Yeah, we talked about core contributors and EIP champions. Validators. So once this software is released, validators have a decision to run the software. And this is typically not a, maybe if you're into politics, you've heard the term whipping the vote. And this is the before the vote, somebody runs around and makes sure everybody is, are you committing to vote for this thing? And then once the vote actually happens, it's mostly procedural. I'm not going to say that analogy exactly maps to this, but it's very, very rare for validators to, there's a certain software release, and then they say, actually, we really don't like this. There's this consensus building that happens. Like these are in some ways artificial boundaries between different user groups or different stakeholders. They're constantly consulted in the process. These people, while they may not work on it full time, they are they're still engaged in the process. I guess that's one thing I would note. So they take the software and they choose whether or not they're going to run it. This is their voice in the system. And in the unlikely case there's a software disagreement, there would be a fork split, or sorry, there would be a chain split. And this is, the current set of validators, and what we want is more diversity or more heterogeneity in this set, which means decision making isn't centralizing into a few different fewer actors rather than more. further out into that diagram, node operators, they may not be participating in validation or block proposal, but they do actually run nodes, and this is very important for actually checking the blocks that are being produced. If you had, let's say, 10 validators, they could easily put out a block that was invalid, and if nobody is checking, or for example, the requirements to run a node are too high, or you have to have really high bandwidth, or it's difficult to run the software. It's going to be challenging to act as a check on the blocks that the validators are producing. So this is another layer of checks and balances that Ethereum really tries to hold to. Then we have the users. Again, this isn't like they're not consulted last. They're actually usually, we're designing for them ultimately. These are the consumers of Ethereum resources, execution, settlement guarantees, the blobs, which is for data availability, or ETH for gas, or ETH as a money. Yeah, these are projects that are building on Ethereum, applications, individuals doing transactions, different companies, and like I said, this is who we ultimately build for, and so we work back from their needs, right? Our fees are too high at this point. We need to scale responsibly and provide lower fees. So this is who we work backwards from. Sometimes there's this discussion of, can USDC or Circle decide fork choice? For example, could they team up with Tether to decide, like, this is the direction we want the Ethereum protocol to go in? And while I can't definitively say like this will never happen, it's extremely unlikely. For one, they are mostly focused on making money and running businesses, and they're not really concerned with how their infrastructure is operating underneath them.
Wait,
They won't
wait.
have their own.
Sorry?
Your argument is they would not be interested in doing that, not that it would not be possible for them to change the architecture.
So the question was, I'm saying it's not possible, but that they wouldn't be interested. So anything is possible if you spend enough time on it, of course. But the likelihood of a project, you get into the right, Ethereum, it's a bit of a paradox. Ethereum has these characteristics of what we call credible neutrality, or it's this idea of no particular entity is privileged above others, right? If I want to purchase block space and you want to purchase it, it doesn't know who we are and it can't give me preference because I'm a core contributor, right? And this is really a core characteristic of how the network operates. And once you lose that, or let's say there's a large entity that starts to influence the core development, you kind of blow up the whole thing. So I'm not going to say it can never happen or like it will never be considered, but I just think it's very unlikely because you'd be, in a sense, killing the golden goose that, it's the system that underlies all of your operations. Maybe an analogy would be like net neutrality. Like if you start to mess with the pipes that you're running through, you have second order effects downstream. Does that answer it? Okay.
The problem with this killing the golden goose is that is what actually happened. But it did kill the golden goose.
Someone killed the golden goose. Oh, in the parable?
Yeah.
I need to read up on my my nursery rhymes. Okay, I won't use that one next time. What was your question?
No, it was a comment about Circle just decide to come up with their own L1. I mean, so people that really do not agree or do not like. Okay, it's more and more common now to see that people are coming with their own L1, and not sure what's actually my opinion about this. I mean, that there is no one big, but I just see it in practice. Okay, that there are more and more. They all try to be basically, Ethereum EVM compatible, but they have their own.
Yeah, so the point is that these stablecoin issuers are making their own L1s. We'll see how it works out. But this is different from the point of, will they try to, let's say, quote unquote, corrupt the Ethereum base layer for their particular benefit? In this case, they're choosing exit over voice, if you wanted to frame it that way. They're just like, we're going to go make our own thing where we can have a little bit more say on the profitability of our infrastructure. So yeah, maybe a bit of a different perspective. Yeah.
mean, your answer is yes, they can. And you explain kind of like how the decision process is happening. Can you give an example how it will manifest itself?
And so when I say yes, this can happen, I mean it's I'm pretty confident that the Easter Bunny doesn't exist. Could, you know, some DARPA research project produce a rabbit that's giant? Maybe, but yeah.
Not interested in the probability. I'm
Sure.
just interested in how it can happen.
Oh, how it would happen. So like in this specific context, this would be this specific frame is the Ethereum core devs release a bit of software that in the interim period, so the releases haven't happened yet, and for the Fusaka upgrade, and it will go live in December. And so there's like a month and a half period where we're waiting, and we assume that everyone will choose to use this software. There's an extremely unlikely scenario where some large issuer like Tether says, we run nodes, right? This is the other thing. They have to be running nodes or something. They have to be participating in consensus. They have to decide like, we would like our infrastructure providers to not run this software upgrade, and we're going to use a different version of Ethereum. I don't know what it would be called, but so that's how it would play out, is they would kind of put pressure on you know, the corporate staking service providers to say, if you don't reject this software, we are going to go use different infrastructure, something like that. Yeah.
Or they could, the worst case scenario is they say that if the fork happens, the tokens on that chain will not be redeemable.
Right.
That usually this comes up if there's a big contentious fork like what happened with the DAO, and whatever Circle and Tether vote would win.
Right. Yeah. So that's it would mostly affect real world asset issuers, bridges, because they can't provide settlement for two different tokens, right? You have to pick one of them that's legitimate. And so this is why I use the stablecoin or Circle example, because they ultimately have to pick one of these. I'm almost done. Yeah. Then we have the community. It's a shared reality, Ethereum, and we agree to its properties. The happy case is that these EIPs give new features that are beneficial. The sad case is contentious features, again, like what we're talking about. They make it close to being released, but are out of sync with community preferences. And to your point, the DAO in 2016, and there's other examples here, including one this year, where we were set to release a change to the EVM called EOF. And when the community started engaging with it, they said, no, we don't want this. And so ultimately it was rejected. And ideally, you minimize the number of cases where you have like this contention or turbulence around releasing a particular software upgrade. So final slide. Present and future challenges. There's always going to be a growing number of stakeholders, assuming that Ethereum is providing utility to companies and individuals and different users around the world. And we need to manage this complexity of more and more people coming into the governance system. These entities will also want to engage in governance. There's only high-hanging fruits. Easy stuff has probably been done, and we need to figure out, okay, what are the things worth pursuing? And then the final question is, in the long term, is ossification truly unavoidable and maybe desirable, because then it's stable for, let's say, large institutional adoption if the foundation isn't changing so much. Okay.
Thank you.